So, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first Fleet Europe webinar, Tendering for Success, a Practitioner's View. We organized this webinar in association with GE Capital, and we are really happy with the support of GE Capital. First, you will have an explanation of Mr. Jerome Van Lancker. He is in charge of the fleet management at Air Liquide, and he manages a big fleet of several thousands of vehicles, and he will explain the tender process that he has developed last year. After that, we will have a more inside view of a fleet supplier on the tender process, and we have invited Mr. Majk Strika, Business Development Director of GE Capital Fleet Services, to give insight in the tender process and in the way a lease provider can bring added value in the tendering. We will end the webinar with a little Q&A session.
Jerome Van Lancker, I'm Frenchman, and as Steven just said, I'm in charge of the long-term car rental family for Air Liquide in Europe. In the following 10 slides, I'm going to share with you the experience acquired from the tenders which were launched at Air Liquide last year. Actually, two tenders were simultaneously launched, one for car makers and one for lessors. First of all, I will briefly introduce the Air Liquide Group. Then I will describe my mission and my scope. And before ending with the lessons I learned during the tenders, I will describe the process of tendering I used. Some data about Air Liquide, which is a French company based in 80 countries and whose activities are closely connected to the gases. We are nearly 50,000 employees worldwide working in three main domains: industrial, healthcare, and environment. By environment, we mean, for instance, hydrogen transports. As you can see on the slide, the revenue in 2012 was 15.3 billion euros. Going to my mission, my scope, as I said before, I'm responsible at European level for purchases linked to vehicles whose weight is below 3.5 tons. It includes 5 main families: long-term car rentals, I'm speaking now about lessors, car makers, fuel, tires, and eco-drive. To be as precise as possible, the insurance is not included in my scope because it's managed at corporate level. The fleet throughout Europe is composed of around 7,200 vehicles. You can see on the pie chart on the left the breakdown by type of vehicle. 64% made with LCV, light commercial vehicles, or vans. These preponderance of LCVs is due to one of our activities named home care, which consists of the deliveries of gas equipment to patients. The breakdown by country on the bar chart on the right side of the slide underlines where the priorities are for me in terms of countries. Obviously, you can see that France, Germany, and Italy were specifically targeted during the tenders. The tender was launched, I should say the tenders were launched beginning of last year. I will show you the timeline before, after that, sorry. The situation in 2012 in Europe was the following one. In fact, we were used to work with one car maker throughout Europe, which was Renault, and with 3 lessors, ALD, Orval, and LeasePlan. The main objectives for me to launch this tender was obviously to be focused on safety for Air Liquide drivers. So safety was the priority. When I speak about safety, I mean the number one parameter in the selection of vehicles. You may know that the vehicles are classified with the Euro NCAP, which give a classification giving stars according to the vehicles. So the objective was to choose to select vehicles with 5 stars. The second objective was to optimize the cost by using a TCO approach. I will come back on this in the following slide. The control of the CO2 was also a strong parameter to take into account, but which is more operational, followed by the fleet managers on a daily basis. And finally, the driver satisfaction, because the vehicle must be a reliable tool and not a concern for the driver. By this, I mean that in fact, we are speaking about the quality of the services proposed by the lessors. Timeline of the tender. You have to keep in mind that launching 2 tenders at the same time is a workload, a heavy workload, and I will also come back on this later on. But this heavy workload can be managed if you follow an accurate timeline process. We started the launching of the tenders in February and March, dedicated to the building of the contents of the tender, and at this stage, the involvement of the stakeholders and of the suppliers is crucial. Then the analysis was achieved by end of May to start with the negotiation in June and July. The deadline was end of August, date at which I wanted to sign the letter of intent. TCO approach. I mentioned before the TCO approach, which is the total cost of ownership approach, and which is for me the way to manage a tender. Why? Because if you consider a total cost of ownership, you fully take into account all the active, what I call the active parameters, for instance, level of CO2 emissions, exactly the type of vehicles you want to select for your fleet, the options, the accessories, all these details are very important to get a quote, an accurate quote from the lessors. The rent as well is part of the TCO, including the necessary services, the services you require for your fleet, for your drivers. The duration of the leasing contract and the mileage. Obviously, the quote will be different if it's for 48 months or for 36 months, for instance. The fuel cost, part of the TCO as well, and also the bonus from the car makers. And these all parameters have to be adapted or established for each country. So you can understand the heavy workload for all these parameters. A TCO approach is also the way to take undeniable decisions, and I will come back on this point, which is for me very important. I forgot to mention on this slide the rule 1. To get accurate answers, you have to ask precise questions. The more you are accurate, the more you get accurate answers. This is very, very important. Again, I will come back on this because accuracy for me is key if you want to launch a tender with a lot of information to deal with. Speaking about LTCR, long-term car rental, raises 2 major pitfalls, according to me. The resistance to change, because if a driver is used to drive a certain vehicle, it's very difficult to change. And also the choice of the vehicles is a sensitive topic in a company. Obviously, it's like for a football team. Everybody has got a good idea on it. Drivers, manager, HR. So you have to find compromise, and you have also, and first of all, to find pragmatic approach. It's why I come back to the TCO approach. If you want to avoid any discussion, you take the TCO approach because it's based on accurate and comparable measures. Resistance to change, for me, the best way to manage this is to involve from the beginning of the process all the stakeholders, meaning you take experts from different entities, from different subsidiaries of your company, and you build what I call the steering committee for tendering. It will make easier the deployment, the future deployment of the agreements. Tips for success. Precision, accuracy. I mentioned several times these words. Again, the more you ask precise questions, the more you will be able to get accurate answers and able to compare apples and apples. And this has to be from the very beginning of the process. Look at the big picture. I mean that in fact, for me, you just have to compare one figure, the global rent, with all the services you require for the fleet. And at the beginning, you have also to be very accurate on this with the lessors to know exactly what they have to quote for. For me, for instance, there is no use of comparing management fee, because if you have zero for management fee, you can imagine that this management fee is put somewhere else in the quotation. It's why the global rents, for me, is enough. Prepare for the workload. As I said before, I decided to launch 2 tenders at the same time. Why? Because from the experience, you can see that for the same car maker, one leasing company can be more competitive on a vehicle A and more expensive on a vehicle B. So you have to compare everything, lessor by lessor, vehicle by vehicle. It will definitely give more workload, but personally, I think it's worthwhile. At the conclusion, if I could sum up in 2 words the experience I got from these tenders, I would say, you won't be surprised, first of all, accuracy, because lots of information, as you can imagine, have to be analyzed and compared from one supplier to another. The second point, the second word, is transparency, because the long-term relationships between our own company and the suppliers, I'm speaking about lessors and car makers, must be based on confidence. I thank you very much for your attention.
My name is Majk Strika. I'm the European Sales Director, Business Development Director for Pan-European Accounts at GE Capital Fleet Services EMEA. GE Capital Fleet Services is one of the largest suppliers in the global fleet leasing arena with around 1.2, 1.3 million cars under management. And I'm with GE since 14 years, of which I've spent around 10 to 11 years in the international fleet team. So in the last 10 years, I've worked directly with customers or managed teams who work with customers, and in total, I've been involved into around 500 to 600 tenders with different levels of success. And I would like to share my experience today with you and give you a flavor where we feel a tender, how a tender should be managed and what should be avoided. As I imagine there is a lot of experienced top professional fleet managers on the line today, I just wanted to add thoughts to Jerome's presentation and stimulate your thinking process instead of giving you a kind of education, because I think you exactly know what to do, and I just wanted to give you a holistic view on top. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them during the question and answer session at the end, or come back to me directly. My contact details will be displayed on the last page of my presentation. Feel free to contact me direct via phone or mobile. So I'm getting already the first call, I think. So here we go. So if you skip on the second page, so I think we have to elaborate on the most important drivers for success. And to me this is, you have to be enabled and you need to have the mandate to run the tender, and you need to get full data transparency after a proper due diligence of your fleet situation on costs, services and processes with your local and HQ team stakeholders. So do not see a tender in an isolated way. Out of the 500 tenders I mentioned before, I had seen, I think, more than a half kind of stopping halfway or never getting into the execution stage, because tenders have been started without the involvement of the most important HQ stakeholders, but more important than that, without the country P&L holders or the country fleet managers. Do not underestimate resistance from your local colleagues. If you come back with a ready-made solution, try to get them on board as soon as possible. So before you go out for a tender, try to get a really clear picture on your current and desired future cost and service situation with a focus on total contract cost, like Jerome already mentioned. Do not limit yourself on the leasing prices you will get submitted during a tender. I can tell you, having seen those 500-600 tenders, many times a tender gets implemented or a decision gets implemented 6, 7, 8, 9 months after you have asked for the prices, after you have made your choice on the most attractive price. And this leads to the fact that in many cases prices are outdated in terms of new models coming from the manufacturers, new RVs from the suppliers, or other structural changes. So really focus on the total contract cost and also the additional value a supplier can deliver. Also anticipate what your costs of change are, so do not forget that there is a clear cost of change. If you're running your fleet today in sole supply with one company, do not forget you will keep those cars over the next 3, 4, 5 years, because there is no real business case to early terminate cars on full operational lease and hand them over to a new supplier. So be aware that you may have to manage 2, 3, 4 suppliers for a transaction period and anticipate those costs also in your whole program. Be also aware of internal resource plannings and implications, so get HR on board. Don't forget you are handling a very sensitive topic. There is potentially a lot of fleet managers for different entities in different countries involved. And by changing to a rather outsourced model, you will not be able to simply delete those jobs. You have to work with your colleagues and find solutions, and therefore also anticipate those restrictions. A very important one, make sure that the tender really covers the service level that matter to you and your stakeholders and meet your needs and expectations. Try to avoid, if I can take the analogy, the waiter reading you the full beef menu in a restaurant when you are a clear vegetarian from the start. I think you should be absolutely clear on the service level, on the cars you want to have, in order to avoid a discussion and workload for you and for the suppliers with no outcome. Last but not least, show that it can be sustainable relationships, so be as open as possible on the anticipated framework duration, on the potential volume you can grant to a supplier. So I really feel this is a partnership, and so you should be clear on the marriage portion to get the best possible wedding present in return from your future supplier. Make sure people are clear about what they are bidding on. And be not surprised if bids on a higher volume you can put on the table are calculated sharper or additional service are put into the game. If we then click on the next page, we clearly observe a trend in the last couple of years to more and more standardized RFIs, RFPs. As much we like them as leasing suppliers, as they allow us to manage tenders in a really lean fashion, I'm not sure that 100 high-level questions deliver more clarity than maybe 20, 30, 40 questions to the points on topics that really matter to you. So you would never get the idea to hug the receptionist in the Hilton Hotel for telling you they're offering beds in the rooms. That's something you simply expect. And as much you can expect a bed in a hotel room, you can expect a maintenance service or a tire change or a fuel card should work very similar between the top players, and they shouldn't celebrate themselves on 20 pages PowerPoint how great they can take care of your maintenance. Rather talk about the challenges you really have to overcome and ask your suppliers to work on their unique selling points, to work exactly on the way they would help you to overcome your issues. As Jerome already mentioned, I think it is very important to meet your suppliers before you go for a tender, to really anticipate the frameworks, the service the suppliers can offer, to really meet the people and understand both parties' needs and expectations. On the next page, we again would like to emphasize it is very important that the supplier should focus on your challenges, and I think it is your right to call for a consultative support from the potential suppliers. Ask for evidence. What did they do to help other companies save costs over lifetime? What did your future supplier do in terms of case studies, white papers? Do they actually deliver on their commitments? Do they really provide solutions that work? I can tell you there's a lot of fashionable PowerPoint slides I've seen in my last 10 years, and I'm not sure that all we put on PowerPoint can be delivered in the market. I am absolutely convinced if you ask explicitly, I have issues on topics A, B, C, D, you will get and you should get the right answers how to overcome your issues. Also, less is more. I think it is very important to focus on a number of cars, a number of mileage durations, instead of running a ton of 5,000 different models, durations, car combinations with rather high-level vehicles without descriptions. Be very precise, like Jerome already said, be accurate, be precise, and ask these suppliers exactly, I need a quote on following car, following equipment, following model, mileage duration, and ask them potentially on top to give you a best in class in their mind, but do not stay high level. That's a, let me say, a mistake or an issue I see a lot of customers face, being too high level in the first round, hoping they would get a good feedback from the market. They face the situation having to analyze and compare 8 different cars from 7 suppliers where they expected to get something in one direction. So be very precise, be clear on what you expect, and help the lease companies to work on the tender to really fit your needs. And also, as Jerome mentioned, tell or ask the lease companies what should be included in the management fee. So for example, if you ask for a relief car, make sure you state that the relief car should be given for X days following category, in order to avoid having 7 times yes tick in a box, we offer relief car, but then when you come to an implementation you find out that the relief car from your future supplier is 2 levels below the car you anticipated or you had hoped for. I have added 2 pictures from recent tenders where I feel they clearly describe why a tender can get into a complicated direction. So if you focus on the first picture, there is no clear description of the model, so leaves a lot of room for interpretation of the suppliers. So you may get different answers from the GEs and from the other 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lease companies, where you hope that you may get the same car, the same configuration, the same price back. There is very limited information on the services. So again, what is there a relief car? Yes. How many days? What level of car is included in the contract? Be very precise on that, and also be aware that base cars will not be ordered afterwards. As much we as a lease company like to see base cars in tenders, as we know they will never be ordered in the next 1-2 years. You should make sure to ask quotes for the cars that your drivers actually will order within the next 10 to 12 months. The second example shows you there's hundreds of different models, but still no clear model description, no duration indicated. We observe there is a trend, more and more tenders coming back to us where customers ask for giving us, where customers ask, please give us the best possible mileage duration. This again leads to the fact you will be facing a misleading situation, having to analyze tons of material from different players instead of getting a direction up front. So just focus on indicative pricing, but be very precise on the cars and models, mileage durations you're asking for. Okay, last but not least, again as a repeat, so some tactical elements to get your tender right. The more representative your tender is to your business, the better the response you can expect. So be precise on the vehicle itself, on the options included, on the mileage duration, additional service required, the scope and coverage of the services, and give on top maybe a cell, a column or a line where the lease companies could fill in their best in class, where they could give you an idea of their quality in terms of consultancy. Again, do not focus on the monthly lease cost. Try to get a good idea on the total contract life, because this is what you pay. It is not the tender only. Thank you very much. And if you want to contact me, you can see my email and my phone number on the screen right now. I'm happy to receive your call or emails, and will try to help and support you with your issues. Thank you.
The last part of this webinar session will be the Q&A session. So if you have a question for one of the speakers, please use the chat function and we will select the most important questions. I already have a few, and the first question that I have is one for Mr. Jerome Van Lancker. Jerome, you told us in your presentation that when organizing the tender, you have used the definition for the car duration and mileage rules, and for one of the participants, those duration terms seem to be a little bit strange. You have used 45 months and 39 months. So the question is, why have you done that and not used more usual standards like 36 or 48 months? Can you a little bit explain that?
Yeah, sure. In a few words, it's very simple. In fact, I took the average of the duration mileage used in the Air Liquide group for the fleets, which is 45 months for PC and 39 months for LCV. It was a decision taken again by all the stakeholders to meet a maximum of entities requirements throughout the group. So I understand that it's not a very used number of months, for instance, but it was a choice taken by the stakeholders.
Okay.
It was a compromise, actually.
Mm-hmm. Okay. A second question that we have is how can, as a fleet client, how can you make sure in your RFP process that the lessor can keep competitive prices over several years? Because a tender process, you don't do it each 6 months. So how can you make sure that the lessor keeps his competitive prices?
Mm-hmm. Well, the idea, if you remember in my presentation, I mentioned the control of the TCO on a long-term point of view, which is for me typically a task for a fleet manager. At the end of the tenders, in fact, I created a catalog for all the European entities for Air Liquide, meaning that in this catalog, they have the choice between 4 lessors. Mm-hmm. Then it's up to them to choose, and this is my practice, my best practice, I recommend. It is up to them, among these 4 lessors, to choose at least 2 lessors, and every time they ask for a quote, they have to ask 2 lessors for the same quote. And then they benchmark regularly the quotations from the lessors. This is for me the best way and the only way to keep a competition between the lessors. Mm-hmm. Because as Mike mentioned before, you can ask a quote during the tender, but then 6 months after, the quotes are obsolete. You have to renew the quotes. So this is again a daily basis task for the fleet manager to benchmark at least 2 lessors.
Okay. A question for Mr. Strika, and we are talking here about a sensible topic also in car fleet management today. We have a question that talks about the residual value, and the question is, How can a lease provider or another company, an OEM, if you do an OEM tender, how can you effectively take into account and measure the residual value as a value in the cost that you are proposing to the fleet client in your tender? How can you be sure that that residual value is really the right one?
Okay. Yeah, very valid question. So with GE, the residual value process is very transparent. So there is only 2 residual values per year, max 3, for some countries, and we give customers the opportunity to benchmark this RV to public parameters, but also explain them. And I think this is key. You cannot fix RVs. So if you want to go for fixed RVs in a tender, like Jerome just mentioned, you will submit quotes today, but those quotes will be obsolete 6, 12, 18 months from the moment you have submitted them. I think it is more about an ongoing transparency reporting. We as lease suppliers should be able to tell customers this is the process how we build RVs, and with GE it's very clear. It is based on the performance we have seen on those cars. It is based on the life cycle moment of the vehicle, so that's data you can get from the manufacturers, not made up by us. And there is also public data benchmark. But here we also have to be very careful, as many clients expect lease suppliers having exactly the same RVs as public benchmark. You just have to understand the public benchmark owners, they do not take not a single dollar risk on the RVs, so therefore it is easy to put a fancy RV in the market without taking a risk for it. I think you should trust your lease suppliers, but underline it with the demand of transparency in a contract to explain you when, why, into which direction changes, and you could potentially fix the prices for a quarterly base as a maximum. I think makes sense. If you go above a quarter, you will bear the risk to pay high risk premiums on the price submitted.
Thank you very much, Mike. Another question for Jerome, a very concrete one. The question is, Jerome, did you run a tender with the car makers for bonuses, or were the lease providers responsible for supplying the discounts? Hello? Oi.
Hello, yes.
Yes,
sorry.
Jerome. So the question is, did you run the tender with the car makers, the OEMs, for bonuses, or were the lease providers responsible for supplying the discounts?
Well, the process of the tenders, I started with the car makers. Okay, so from the car makers, I got discounts and bonuses. And these discounts were communicated to the lessors, which provided me with the quotes. Is it clear?
Okay. Thank you. A question for Mike, perhaps. We have seen that Jerome has run his tender process for OEMs and car lease suppliers almost simultaneously. Now, a lot of questions are, is there like a preferable order to do tenders in car fleet management? Is it, for example, best to do first this and then that, or does that depend on some real specific strategic objectives? Can you explain that a little bit more, Mike?
I think it rather depends on the ability of a customer. Customer has to decide what is easier to move long term. Is it the car policy, is it the makes and models, or is it the lease supplier? So if you run a tender for fleet first and then the tender for the leasing suppliers, you will bear the risk that you will potentially only get access to lease suppliers which do have good standing, good RV, good pricing with a lease supplier. And if you run the tender in the other way around, it's not necessarily better. So you have to decide, will you be able to change your lease suppliers faster than your car policy? If so, then focus on your OEMs first and then go for the lease suppliers. I think the way Jerome did it is very good. It clearly gives you indications to balance out which lease supplier could support you in which scenario, because if you do it in the wrong order, there is a high risk that you potentially choose a brand or you choose a supplier which does not fit to the other way around.
Okay. A question for Jerome. How have you, or how do you see that you can include specific terms for mileage recalculation? Because it can happen that the mileage that you have asked for, that it's not really the real one in reality. So have you done something specific?
Well, the idea of the duration mileage given for the tender was to have a comparison between the lessors. Obviously, on a daily basis, we are not speaking about the same duration and mileage rules. And again, for me, this is a fleet manager's task to adjust this. And this is, for me, part of every year. I recommend to the fleet managers to work with the lessors to adjust all the leasing contracts, the pending leasing contracts. Because if you decide at the beginning of the leasing contract duration and the mileage, you might notice after 1 year or 18 months that you are not on the track of these mileage and duration rule. So you have to adjust regularly, and this is also a key in terms of partnership with the lessors.
Okay, thank you very much. I have received here a question for Mike. Mike, someone asks you if you agree to the following topic. Lease prices will anyway differ over time. So the only real subject of tendering for leasing is the definition of overall SLAs. Do you agree with that? And with SLAs, for example, free return rates, matrix quotes, terms of payment.
I tend to agree. It's not 100%. So yeah, the lease, you should get a flavor on the lease prices. You should understand, is a supplier in a country really competitive? You need to really evaluate which supplier can cover the most countries pricing-wise, top 1, 2, 3, 4. But yes, I think it is more important to focus on the service you're expecting. And I would even go a step further. I think you should focus on the long-term cost reduction programs. As mentioned before, we are, I would say, a rather harmonized market. It is a bread and butter service. It's like the Hiltons, the Marriotts, the Novotels, the Sofitels. In all those hotels, you're getting offered the bed, the shower, and the breakfast. It's about the nitty-gritty details. It's about the location. It is about the cars they can, as you just mentioned, potentially give you for free as an early termination. It is about an overall service level which leads you then to an overall reduction of costs. So I think you should focus on consultancy. That's something you simply should demand. And I feel that the market should be mature enough, but I feel it is not mature in terms of the demand from the customers. You should ask much more than for the standard bread and butter service.
Okay. Okay. A question for the both of you, I think, and the question is, and we will start with Jerome, to what degree do you recommend a centralized versus a local approach to tendering? Perhaps Jerome can start and then Mike can add his comments.
Okay. Well, in fact, the way we work at Air Liquide is to centralize this kind of tender, but centralization doesn't mean to forget the local teams. So again, this is very important at the beginning of the tender to take into account the opinions coming from the different countries, because then when you want to deploy the taken decisions, it will be easier. So centralization for me is very important because then you can collect all the data. You can also have a stronger power in front of the car makers, in front of the lessors because of the negotiation. When I speak about 7,000 cars, I have obviously more weight than if I speak about only 500 cars, and it is a fact. So I think you have to combine the two, the centralization to have a full picture in front of the suppliers, but you have also to be very close to the local teams, to the local fleet managers, to take into account their requirements.
Okay. Mike, do
So
you
my
have something to add?
observation,
Yes.
in the last 10 years, we have seen a clear trend to an internationalization of car fleet tenders. And in the last 12, 18 months, we even see a step further going into the global direction. Yes, centralization makes sense to the extent that your central headquarter, your central steering committee really has the mandate to implement topics. I think it's, for me, no-brainer. You should leverage your buying power, absolutely. If you talk about your 2,000 car fleet worldwide to GE, I can assure you that your price and service level is different than if you talk in bits and pieces on country level and grant us potentially 20% through 2 or 3 countries. Nevertheless, I still, as Jerome just mentioned, it is very, very important not to give the impression of a blind centralization and just do it because it kind of feels, it feels nice to do a European approach. If your organization is not ready to execute on central decisions, on central projects, I think you should use the tender for the leveraging of buying power only, and then give the countries, maybe as Jerome did, the decision between 2 or 3. I do not see a business case for giving every country the freedom to do what they want. Yes, it's nice to have, but I'm not convinced that this will lead to the optimum fleet cost scenario. A slight centralization, absolutely needed.
Okay. A question for Jerome. Jerome, you, before that you started the tender process, you had a single supply deal with one car manufacturer, Renault, across Europe.
Yes.
So the question is, what was really the additional value from the OEM tendering phase for you and your company?
I was sure that the question would be raised. Well, in fact, yes. We were used to work with Renault for 4 years, and at the end of the tender last year, we got to the same results, meaning that, to be straightforward, we still work with Renault at European level. And it comes from a very pragmatic thinking. I'm not going to explain again the process of the TCO approach, but this is typically the result of the TCO approach, and we got to the choice of Renault for Europe. Honestly, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one to face this point, but you can imagine that if you want to deploy Renault in Germany, it's not an easy task. So honestly, Renault is the selected supplier for Air Liquide Group. But you can imagine that in countries like Germany or Austria, the deployment of the Renault catalog, I would say, is not achieved yet. And well, it's a long process, and it's very difficult. And even if I am a very optimistic person, I think I will struggle to convince the German drivers to use Renault cars.
Okay. A question for Mike. Mike, we have seen in the presentation of Jerome that his tender process has taken about 7 months. Yes, but the question is now for you. What do you think is the most appropriate time frame for a car lease company to prepare an RFP? Because perhaps your fleet clients are having other expectations than is really realistic to answer them quite correctly. So can you tell us a little bit more about
Absolutely. I'm heading the European bid desk, and my colleagues are working on the consolidation of tenders. So we have a centralized bid desk, which makes it really easier compared to a situation when you have to do it really country by country. But still, I feel that for a proper RFI, you should grant the suppliers 3 to 4 weeks, and the same for the RFPs. I think Jerome was, compared to many tenders I've seen, even very fast, because he did even the contract awards after 7 months. I think even the contract negotiation was finished short after. So if you take per round a month, RFI, RFP, and then I would invest another month to meet your suppliers and shortlist them and meet them at least in 1-2 meetings. I'm surprised that many companies give their fleet, which is a very sensitive and a very costly topic, into the hands of people they have seen maybe once in a 90 minutes beauty parade, and they have read maybe a 60-pager once after 2 or 3 weeks. I would invest more time into meetings, into presentations, into task force discussions. When you describe in workout sessions, this is my challenge. If you would be granted the contract, how would you help me to overcome my challenges? And I think if you give this another 4 to 6 weeks, I think 6 months in total should be fine.
Okay, another question for Jerome. It's a question about the lease providers or on the lease providers. Some leasing companies are using for the moment a sort of mobility grid with fixed costs in case of any modification in the mileage or the duration. Is this something that you have requested or that you are thinking that can be an added value?
Yes,
you?
Yes, it is definitely an added value, and it was also a request from different countries, provided that the lessors are able to propose this flexibility grid, as it's a name sometimes by the lessors. So definitely it was part of the tenders as a parameter to be able to get from the lessors in different countries this flexibility grid, which is for me an added value from the lessors.
Okay. And then the last question, because I see that we have had already a lot of questions, and the last question is a question on somehow the starting point of the tender process. And it's a question for you both. I would like to know who are the most important internal stakeholders to involve in the tender process. Perhaps this time we can start with Majk.
Yeah, so I think it's different company by company, but I think the main stakeholders to me are clearly the finance guys, the finance teams, which clearly will evaluate the future cost scenarios. The HR teams have to be involved, and I think the local P&L holders should also be taken into your team to be sure to get the right backwind if it comes to a decision.
Okay. And Jerome?
Well, in addition to what Mike just mentioned, I would say that in the steering committee, as I named, I put what I call experts from France, and by experts I mean fleet managers, because it's also very important to have the operational point of view. HR, obviously, finance is also key. Representatives from different countries, fleet managers also, so yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for your answers. Thank you also very much to all the participants for their questions. I think that we have had a really wonderful and an exciting session where we learned a lot. As you know, this was the beginning of a Fleet Europe webinar series. We will try to organize still some webinars later this year. And Fleet Europe and GE Capital want to thank all of you for participating to this webinar.